Good morning, everyone. I'm Wendy Cutler, the Vice President at the Asia Society Policy Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you this morning for a special session with the Undersecretary of the State Department for Economic Growth, Energy, and Environment, Jose Fernandez. When we think of economic agencies in the U.S. government, the Commerce Department, the Treasury Department, and my old stomping grounds, USTR, come to mind. But in fact, the State Department plays a crucial role in advancing our international economic agenda. And under the Biden administration, Undersecretary Fernandez and his team have been exceptionally active in areas like supply chain resiliency, critical mineral security, and semiconductor partnerships. This morning, we're going to concentrate on another issue that is near and dear to the State Department's heart, and one where they have initiated efforts that have been particularly impactful, and that is countering economic coercion, which essentially means pushing back against unfair economic pressure tactics that certain countries are using to influence or control the actions of others. This could include steps by certain countries to block imports, restrict exports, curb tourism, and a whole host of other economic leverage tools to achieve geopolitical goals. And at the State Department, Undersecretary Fernandez has a dedicated team referred to as the Firm, which has assisted over a dozen nations in navigating and mitigating such economic pressures. Today, we will explore how economic coercion affects the business environment. We'll discuss U.S. government strategies for countering these tactics and examine potential public-private collaborations to build resilience. Now, just a few words about Undersecretary Fernandez, who's had such an impressive career in the areas of law, finance, and diplomacy. He was a partner at a leading law firm here in New York, where he advised clients on major international deals in Europe and emerging markets. He's also no stranger to the State Department, having served as an assistant secretary during the Obama administration when I first got to know him. So I am delighted to welcome Undersecretary Fernandez to the Asia Society stage. He will be offering some remarks. Following the remarks, I will moderate a discussion with him, and after that, we will open the floor up for audience questions. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Undersecretary Fernandez.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you, Wendy, for that great introduction. The one thing she didn't mention is that she actually has written, Wendy and her team wrote a wonderful report on economic coercion a couple of months ago that I thought really encapsulated what we were trying to do. So if there's something you do not understand, just read her report and save yourself some time. What we're here to do is to talk about something that we have spent a fair amount of time on during my time at the State Department during this go-around, and that's countering really PRC economic coercion. And we start from a basic premise in something that I think is evident in our time, my time at least, in D.C., is that nations are no longer relying solely on military power, military strength in order to assert their power across the globe. Economic influence is a primary weapon. And there are really no bright lines anymore that I've discovered, at least, bright lines between economic security and national security. At times they are interchangeable, and they're always intertwined. Beijing is a great practitioner of this economic coercion strategy. President Xi Jinping, in fact, in April of 2020, several years ago, already stated that if China can dominate global supply chains, It can force other nations to depend on the PRC and then use that dependence to leverage, to exert leverage over Beijing's trading partners. And we've seen this over and over again, and they continue to do it. One of the first instances that I remember was in 2010, after a dispute between Japan and the PRC over the Senkaku Islands. Beijing at that time used its leverage over rare earths minerals that Japan needed in order to sustain their automobile industry. And Japan had really no other source at that time than the PRC for a lot of these minerals. So Tokyo was exposed to Beijing's demand. We're seeing it, in fact, now on the critical mineral space with gallium, germanium, and other rare earths and critical minerals. In 2017, a few years later, when South Korea wanted to deploy U.S.-made missile defense systems to the Korean peninsula in order to protect against the threat of North Korean missiles, the PRC saw this as a threat. So it imposed restrictions on South Korean citizens traveling to the PRC and barred the import of key South Korean goods and services. And not only that, but K-pop artists were banned from touring across China. A couple of years later, in 2020, after Australia announced that they were opening an investigation into the origins of COVID-19, Beijing hit Australia where it hurts: wine, beef. Core industries to Australia's economy and critical exports to the PRC were all subject to import restrictions by Beijing. I could go on. Norway, for the Nobel Prize Committee's award to a Chinese dissident. Canada, for a decision to arrest a prominent businesswoman. The Philippines, several others. These were all test cases for the PRC, and frankly, it's clear that even when they failed, they were effective. The PRC's use of economic coercion has worked because oftentimes it's not the actual coercion itself, but it's actually the threat. The threat of coercion is often enough to stop countries from making sovereign decisions that may upset the PRC in the first place. I've seen it in my conversations with countries all over the world. Oftentimes they have second thoughts about taking certain actions, saying certain things, simply because of the threat of Chinese coercion. So since I came into this job in 2021, countering the PRC's efforts on economic coercion has been one of my top priorities. And I think we've been successful. Countries around the world have awakened to the potential consequences of being too dependent on China, and many have taken steps to reduce their exposure and build their resilience. So roll the tape forward to 2021. Lithuania allowed Taiwan to open a Taiwanese representative office. What ensued was that China banned exports from Lithuania. When that didn't work, when the Lithuanians continued in their actions, China banned EU exports that included any Lithuanian components. You had, in fact, in the customs software and PRC economic customs software for imports, the Lithuania did not appear. And so this was an action in response to a sovereign decision on the part of Lithuania to allow Taiwan to open up a trade office. So at that time, we had just been in office for a few months, and we decided that we had seen this movie before and that it was time to stop the tape. So we took some actions. First of all, and I think this oftentimes is not discussed, moral support. You know, when a little country, when Lithuania gets in the crosshairs of the PRC, it's pretty scary. Small country, a couple of million people, facing coercion from a behemoth. There is political opposition. There are several. There are always groups, and there were groups in Lithuania that were saying, "Why are we getting involved in an international dispute when we are just the grass between two elephants?" That one of the things that we did is early on, Secretary Blinken, a number of cabinet officials, and I and others went to Lithuania, and we basically said, this is a sovereign decision. This is something that a country should be allowed to do, And we will support Lithuania no matter what it decides to do on this score. So the moral support part of this, I think, was important. Secondly, we provided concrete support to Vilnius. One of the things that the PRC did is to cancel a $300 million export credit to Lithuanian companies. And in one of my first meetings with Exim Bank, they first apologized that they couldn't do more, but then they said, well, maybe it's not 300 that we can put together. We will provide a $600 million export credit facility to Lithuania. So in 5 minutes, I had done, I was no longer getting paid by the hour, but I'd been able to double the export credit that Lithuania had. This was important. In fact, it hasn't been used that much. But again, it provided the moral support in order to let a country that was facing this kind of coercion know that they were not alone. We also mobilized a number of our embassies in the Indo-Pacific to find new markets for Lithuanian goods that were being blocked by Beijing. The Department of Defense signed a reciprocal defense procurement agreement with Lithuania. We actually helped to finalize, and this was a pure coincidence, a scientific review of Lithuanian eggs. Who would have thunk it, right? Eggs in diplomacy. Well, it turns out that egg farmers in Lithuania happen to be very politically powerful. And so we were able to help to finalize a scientific review of Lithuanian eggs, and lo and behold, in 2022, Lithuanian agricultural exports to the U.S. increased by 20%. And in fact, this is, if you recall, this was when we had an egg shortage in the U.S. So the additional eggs from Lithuania actually helped U.S. consumers here. Today, Lithuania has survived the PRC's pressure, and frankly, on the economic level, it's doing quite well. The third thing that we did, in addition to the moral support and the economic support, frankly, is we decided that we were going to put together a playbook. We had seen, as I said, this movie before, and we had to come up with a way to deal with these kinds of actions on the part of the PRC going forward. So we have put together a group. Wendy called it the firm. It's just a number of people in my office whose job it is to respond to when countries come into our offices to get help when they're facing economic coercion. And oftentimes they say, well, give us the Lithuania package, even though they have no eggs. But to us, this was a big indicator of success. It showed us that in watching what we had done to help, other countries saw something that was attractive and that they wanted in on. So they reach out when they are considering potential actions that they know that Beijing will not like, and there are others that actually come to us after they have received some threats. And we call it a firm, a consulting firm that doesn't go out for clients. This is a very serious decision on the part of any country, and we do not advertise. We will help if asked. But one of the things that we do not do is guarantee support. We don't know what will come down the pike, and also we just make it clear that we are not egging a country to do anything going forward. We will support them in whatever decision they take. So I'm not going to get into the specifics of how we help out countries, but one thing that's important is that when countries come in and they're facing a threat, it's usually a new issue for them. Again, they're facing a behemoth and they're scared, but it is not new to us. We've put together with a number of people at the State Department, a number of methods in order to anticipate what some of the actions that the PRC will take. So this is not new for us. We're seeing these cases again and again. We're learning from them. There's not a month that a country doesn't come into the State Department and wants to talk to us about potential threats. And we're learning. We're learning all the time. And we always realize that no matter what we do, the PRC will often throw a curveball. we cannot anticipate every action on the part of Beijing. So we keep learning, and we use the lessons that we've learned to help partner countries anticipate the Beijing playbook and prepare for it. I said earlier that economic coercion works. It works because it's always in the back of the mind of countries when they decide to take action. But I think it's fair to say that that Beijing has overplayed its hand with economic coercion. They're doing it in every region. They're doing it on a wide array of issues. And many economies are realizing that there is no safe space you can stay in order to avoid landing in the crosshairs of the PRC. That's why if you've followed, and Wendy, I'm sure you have followed this very closely, the Japanese G7 presidency actually spent a lot of time standing up for the first time an anti-economic coercion mechanism of its own, and that is a work in progress. That is something that the Japanese have followed up on, and that was another measure of our success when the G7 decided that the time had come to band together in order to resist economic coercion. Many partners are also beginning to do their own planning. They're thinking, what if this happens to me? And many would like to have help, just like Lithuania did. Public support is something that we continue to provide. We're glad to provide it. But most countries actually prefer the private support. So we will never talk about a country coming into the State Department looking for help. Our aim is to neutralize the bullying so that Beijing's economic coercion does not work. We create spaces, again, for countries to make their own sovereign decisions in their own national interest. And something the question that will often come to us is, when does a country know that it's being coerced by the PRC? In fact, oftentimes they don't even know it. Beijing's measures are usually sudden, are usually without warning. They do not necessarily follow any legislation. It's not a public. It is not. There are no public announcements. The measures lack any transparency. There's no appeal mechanism, and a victim country's largest agricultural products can be withheld at the port for phytosanitary concerns, or when the name of the country simply does not appear on the importing countries on the Chinese website. So these are unpredictable actions. They're indirect, they're unjustified, and they're really never acknowledged to be in response to a foreign policy decision on the part of a country. What have we learned? What have we learned? Well, something that I think has become clear is that time is of the essence. Markets can adjust in an economic coercion scenario, but that takes time. The transitions period, as I said earlier, can be scary. Jobs can be lost. Harvests can rot in warehouses and ports. And stakeholders in the country that are impacted by economic coercion may press their government to accommodate the PRC out of fear that there is no substitute for the PRC market. So being able to respond quickly is important, which means we have to prepare. Countries have to prepare for this kind of action. But they have to know also that they're not alone, that they can work with the U.S. and other countries. And this is when we have a competitive advantage, I think, what the U.S. does. We have lots of friends around the world. There are many, if you look at our alliances in Europe, in Asia, and elsewhere, we can mobilize a lot of these alliances in order to help countries that are victims of coercion. But again, we leave the decision to the governments themselves. So we now have a playbook, and I think we will continue to use it. Unfortunately, this is not the last time we'll see this movie. But the last thing I'll leave you with is, on a broader scale, you've all heard about something that used to get you booted out of cocktail parties, supply chains, diversifying supply chains. And this highlights the importance of diversifying our supply chains, which has been a constant constant aspect of what we've been able to do in this administration, not only in the case of economic coercion, but if you look at what we've tried to do on critical minerals, on medical supply chains, medical equipment, semiconductors with the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. It's all part of trying to engage countries, engage our allies, and prepare for the kinds of economic reprisals that have become part of the PRC's policy. Thank you, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much for your remarks. You put a lot on the table. I guess my first question would be, you've said China has a playbook, we have a playbook, but is this playbook evolving? And how is the State Department and your team and other agencies grappling with an evolving playbook? Are we prepared?
Well, we try to be prepared, but again, the PRC will always throw a curveball when it engages in these acts. We are learning all the time, and we are learning every time we get a country coming in the door for asking for help. So it is a work in progress. It will always be a work in progress, and the measure of our success is countries keep coming in, and for the most part, they are prepared if and when they get coerced, and they decide to make their own sovereign decisions. So I think we're prepared, but let's not overstate the fact or understate the fact that this is going to continue, and that this has become an aspect of Chinese economic policy and foreign policy that we will continue to see going forward.
Were you surprised in the Lithuania case when China not only took actions against Lithuania, but then kind of brought in their coercion to the rest of Europe? How did that play out?
So it played out. We were surprised. They hadn't done that before. It also backfired.
But can you explain to the audience what they did?
So it's very simple. Lithuania itself, 1% of their exports went to the PRC. So their trade with the PRC was frankly minimal. And when the PRC realized that their direct economic coercion was not working, they decided to basically ban any EU product that included any Lithuanian component, and that was that was something that they hadn't done before. What happened is that again, this is where our allies and partners help. What happened was that the EU took action. They realized that unless they did this, they were going to see this kind of response from the PRC. So they filed a WTO case, and they took certain actions, and they were very vocal in supporting Lithuania. Yeah, we were surprised, but we were also very pleasantly surprised, or at least were pleased to see that the EU took this under its wing, and that they enacted something that they called an anti-coercion instrument, which they tell us they had been holding in the wings to use against the U.S. for our sanctions, but they had it ready, but they came out very strongly in support of this, because again, had they allowed the PRC to do this, they were going to be facing this kind of a threat going forward.
How about talking a bit about the role of the private sector, both in the targeted country, but also in the U.S.? So, for example, my understanding is, as you mentioned in your remarks, that a lot of times countries don't even know if they're being coerced at the outset, and their front line are private sector companies that all of a sudden realize they can't get their products into China. So what role do they play? And also in the U.S., if a targeted country comes to us for assistance and they, for example, want to partner with a U.S. company, do we bring in our private sector to try and establish relationships to help them mitigate the impacts of coercion?
Great question. The private sector, not just in the U.S., but in a number of other countries, was quite helpful. In our case, we actually did a lot of midwifing for the Lithuanians. We brought in our companies. Something again, in this job you learn along the way. Lithuania's major technology export, and something they're very proud of, was the lasers, because during in the Soviet era, every state, every province had its own specialty, and the Lithuanians, the Communist Party had made Lithuania the laser focus of the old USSR. So they wanted to export lasers. So we put them in touch with technology companies. They got investment. They have been able to establish offices elsewhere. So getting the private sector in a number of partner countries, and also bringing them into the U.S. and having them speak to potential investors, potential customers in the U.S., was quite helpful, and they took it from there. The one angle that we have to be careful about, because there are we have certain regulations and certain safety measures that we have to observe, is agricultural products. They had to go. We couldn't do immediate support simply because they had to go through an SPS review here in the U.S. Under the U.S. Agricultural Department. But I think the private sector was important, and we did that quickly. And the Lithuanians were able to see that there were markets elsewhere, and that in fact, just like it happened with Australia, that many will argue, Wendy, that Australia benefited from having to diversify its markets after economic coercion. Lithuania realized that this could actually play to their benefit. So yeah, the private sector is critical, and it's one of our strengths.
Maybe we can move over more to the supply chain resilience angle. And you'd mentioned that how important that is just overall, but particularly with respect to mitigating the impacts of economic coercion. You've spearheaded the initiative, the Minerals Security Partnership in the U.S. government. And my understanding right now, there are 14 members, but maybe with with Argentina, are you
14 countries plus the EU. 55% of the world's GDP.
And what's the purpose of this partnership, and what are you doing under this partnership? Because critical minerals is a sector that China is so dominant in, and the market can't be changed overnight. But how are you working with other countries, and are you encouraging other countries to join this partnership, or are they seeing the value in their efforts to diversify to sign up for this partnership?
How much time do you have? All right, so
we'll take the Cliff Note version.
Yeah, let's do a summary. We have the Mineral Security Partnership is a group of 14 countries plus the European Union, really created because we have both a need and a problem. And the need is that for us to be able to achieve our clean energy goals that the Biden administration has been adamant in pursuing, we're going to need, just to give you an example, 42 times the amount of lithium we consume today by 2050, 25 times the amount of manganese, cobalt, and the like. These numbers are oodles of magnitude. That's a need. The problem is that right now, many of these critical minerals about 2/3 of them are controlled by the PRC, either mined, refined, or otherwise controlled. For some minerals, graphite, 95% of the world's graphite is controlled by China. We need them for electric vehicle batteries. So what we decided to do was to use our competitive advantage, bring together countries, include India is part of it, the Europeans, Canada, Japan, Korea, Australia, to work together on exchanging information on potential projects, working together on finance, working together on investments, recycling, because recycling of critical minerals could reduce our needs to mine them by at least 20 to 25%. And then lastly, to do it in a way that I thought was, again, our angle here was to follow the highest environmental, social, and governance principles. Mining can be a dirty, polluting activity. Countries don't want to have to choose between economic coercion, economic growth, and and environmental degradation. So we've gone to countries. We now have a couple of days ago we signed an agreement for graphite with Tanzania and Korea. We have another when the PRC. This gets to your question. When the PRC imposed export restrictions on germanium, and I could take a poll here, and I've got to believe that not a lot of people know what germanium is used for, but it's important. We were able to find a supplier that will increase the global supply of germanium by as much as 20%. So it's a response to another angle of economic coercion, which is a dependence, and you could extrapolate that to medical devices, semiconductors, and the like. But in the critical mineral space, we are making progress. There's still a lot of work to do. We're still vulnerable, and mines take a long time to come on stream. But this is something that we have as part of the work at the State Department taken on.
Before we open the floor up for audience questions, just one final question to you on semiconductors. Under the CHIPS Act, there's been a lot of publicity about money given to companies for establishing plants and other facilities in the United States. But what most people don't know is the State Department was given a significant fund of money to also encourage partnerships with countries and companies in countries to develop the semiconductor supply chain. And in some ways, when we think of semiconductors, we think of the government our government forcing other countries to agree to our export controls. But in many respects, this pot of money you have, it's really carrots and incentives. How are you using that money? And are there any specific examples you can give of countries that are stepping up to the plate and ones that could serve as models for other countries?
Great question. Thank you. So the CHIPS Act gave Commerce $53 billion to attract semiconductor investments in the U.S. The State Department got a couple of zeros less. We received $500 million over 5 years. But what are we using that for? What we're hearing from companies, semiconductor companies in Taiwan and Japan and elsewhere, is that oftentimes they don't get the workforce development, the workforce. They need additional qualified workers. Some of their activities, especially on the downstream side, really shouldn't be done in the U.S. So we've focused on right now 7 countries around the world, 3 in Latin America, 3 in Asia, and 1 in Africa, to basically help train workers that can become part of the semiconductor friendshoring aspect. And right now we have agreements with the universities. We've had agreements with a number of semiconductor associations to upgrade the ecosystem of semiconductor ecosystems in those 7 countries, and we're making progress. Costa Rica is one of those countries. They have been able. We've helped them to create a center of excellence to improve their workforce, and they have received substantial investments from Intel and others, over $1 billion of investments in order to bring back some of those supply chains into the U.S. Again, it takes time, but it's part of what we at the State Department are doing, while the Commerce Department is in charge of attracting the investments into the U.S. And I could go through the numbers, but it has been successful. Out of the 53 billion, the Commerce Department has actually dispersed at this point over $40 billion. That has leveraged a number of private investments, over $300 billion worth of investments in the U.S. as a result of the $40 billion plus already spent by Commerce. So it's creating jobs, and we're seeing some successes as well.
Well, great. With that, why don't we open the floor up to questions from the audience? I'll try and take a few questions at a time. Wait for the microphone, and if you can just introduce yourself and where you're from when you ask a question.
Hi, Wendy. My name's Tom Byrne. I'm with the Korea Society. I'm interested in the unintended consequences of U.S. government actions on trying to restrict, and particularly in the case of South Korea, the South Korean exports of semiconductor technology to China. And there's been an executive order that Treasury has, I think, put out regulations, implementation regulations that could affect Korean companies' ability to export to China and operate in China. And some of those operations include importing goods, products that go into South Korean subsidiary production in the U.S. So this, I think, potentially exposes South Korean companies to retaliation from China if China views Korea tilting towards America too closely. It's a complicated situation, but how is the U.S. government managing this to limit or minimize the unintended consequences on the bottom line of South Korean companies?
Thanks, Tom. Yes.
Thanks. David Zweig, HK Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. I retired. I live here in New York now. WTO, could you just say, is it of any use at all on this issue?
How much time do you have?
Yeah. Well,
Yep. Plus, that's a Wendy question.
yeah.
She was the USTR.
Up here.
Hi, good morning. Karen Bhatia. I teach economic development and innovation at Stanford University. I have two questions. The first one is about how are we leveraging relationships with India, given competition between India and China as a strategic advantage?
With whom, I'm sorry?
India.
India.
And the second question that I have was, I previously led tech strategy for the New York City Economic Development Corporation during COVID. And one of the issues that we faced was production of PPE in New York. And given supply chain issues, what are your thoughts about, how do we think about maintaining or, onshoring manufacturing for PPE in consideration of like long-term financial sustainability? That's one of the biggest issues that we faced. We thought about ways in which for garment manufacturing, we could have some small manufacturers and factories here for innovation purposes for our designers, but thinking about long-term sustainability for scaling that was a challenge.
You have those.
So on the unintended consequences, that is a concern, okay, in terms of, but this goes to the whole dual-use export controls piece that actually is not run but out of the State Department. But it is, I think the answer for that we're seeing is countries are diversifying their supply chains, they're diversifying their markets, and they're protecting themselves against that kind of a backlash on the part of the PRC. But it is something that we discuss with countries all the time, and that's something they bring up with us always.
If I can just add to
Yeah,
that, just to kind of, give some kudos to the administration, particularly when it comes to Korea. I think you guys have done a great job quietly listening to Korea's concerns and then trying to work around them to minimize any unintended consequences.
Well, so a good example. Thank you. A good example of that is when the IRA was passed, and the Koreans were actually felt that this was going to hurt their domestic industries, and we had a lot of conversations, and one of the things we made clear to them is that there was no way that we could achieve our clean energy goals without the support of our allies, Korea, Japan, and others. And we trotted out some numbers. We provided some advice, and we said, well, Korean electric vehicle battery manufacturers could have as much as 60% the U.S. market in the battery space. The fact of the matter is, they are doing quite well, and they have seen that as an opportunity, and that was done quietly, not just with government officials, but a number of us went out to Korea, met with their companies, and actually, they have seen the opportunities, and they have been probably one of the largest beneficiaries of the support given under the IRA for batteries. India can be part of the solution of that. They are a partner in the ITSI fund that I referred to earlier in response
Under the
to
CHIPS Act.
Under the CHIPS Act, where we are engaging with the 7 countries that I mentioned, and one of them is India, and India can be a great partner. So again, that we see opportunities. Something we have been quite adamant about is that this is not a zero-sum game. If we are successful under the CHIPS Act in galvanizing additional technologies, under the Inflation Reduction Act as well, the market the global market will benefit. We will create technology that will benefit countries that have nothing to do with the IRA. On reshoring PPEs, we're working a lot on that. I'm actually thinking more of Latin America in terms of PPEs, and we are now working with. We've created something we call the Economic and Health Dialogue of the Americas, and under a lot of acronyms, America's Partnership, to work with countries in manufacturing PPEs that do not require high levels of technology. In Central America, we could do face masks, for example, things of that nature. So that's something that's not necessarily on the Asian side, but we are working on it closer to home.
So, Jose, India is doing a lot to try and attract these shifting supply chains, including providing incentives and tax breaks and getting rid of red tape for investors, et cetera. How do you evaluate their efforts? Do we actually see American companies expanding their operations in India, and are companies experiencing some hiccups or some obstacles to expanding their presence in India? And how is the State Department working with India to try and create a better business environment?
So I actually have a couple of people from my shop in India today working on those issues. There are opportunities. Look, India is a complicated country in terms of doing business, and yes, there will always be hiccups. But right now, we're seeing lots of interest on the part of Indian companies, and we believe that they can be part of the solution. And talk to me when my people come back in a couple of days.
We'll hold you to that. Do you want to say anything on the WTO?
I'd rather, you are the expert on this. Wendy, I've met Wendy during the Obama administration when we were working on TPP, if you recall. Look, we are going to have to address the WTO, and obviously there's lots of concerns about their overextending themselves, and at the same time, we've got to bring it in line with our current issues. One of them being PRC industrial policy, and that's something that. But I actually would love to hear your thoughts on it.
What I would add is that the WTO has just encountered major difficulties in updating rules and negotiating new rules, particularly the rules that we need in today's environment. So we're left with a set of old rules which really aren't fit for purpose for today. And I think, unfortunately, that's going to result in more and more countries trying to figure out how they can move forward and not be sued under the WTO, but maybe just take those risks and decide that we need to do what we need to do, and we can't let these WTO outdated rules constrain our behavior. I don't think any country does that enthusiastically, but it is a challenge. And in my perspective, there doesn't seem to be a lot of hope on the horizon with now 166 members in the organization that these new rules can be devised to address issues like coercion, like supply chain resilience, and frankly, and we discussed this earlier, pursuing sectoral agreements.
I think there's a discussion to be had on how do you modernize the WTO. I think it's fair to say that it was not meant to address issues of state-owned enterprises and state-led economic policy. It was made for a much more private sector-led, market-driven solutions, and I think there's a lot of thinking to be done here. And I think certainly there are many who will say it's broken, and we need to find a way of keeping the benefits and at the same time modernizing, and doing it with 166 countries, many of which have an interest in keeping it the way it is going to be hard.
Okay, another round of questions. Okay, over here. Okay.
May I? Okay, my name is Manik Mehta. I'm a syndicated journalist. My question relates to the U.S. relations with ASEAN in Southeast Asia. How do you see relations developing with this community? Except for the Philippines, the other nations have had very close ties, economic as well as political ties with China. Where do you see the U.S. position in this particular area? Thank you.
Okay, over here.
Sure. Byron Cowan, Capital Alpha Partners. Can you talk about the scalability of what you're able to do at the firm? And more importantly, what else could you use from Congress in terms of authorization or appropriations as you think about these responses going forward?
I think the answer will be more money. And one last question in the back.
Hi, I'm James Robinson. I work for a firm called APCO. We're an advisory firm, and I work a lot on commercial issues and coercion. And I guess my question is, China is also very good at commercial enticement. It's created tremendous opportunities, and you talk about not wanting to create a zero-sum game. Many companies now are increasingly seeing it as a zero-sum game, and putting myself in the shoes of Chinese companies, they would suggest that there is reciprocity happening, and that actually the U.S. is using. You mentioned the European anti-coercion mechanism. The U.S. is playing the same game as China. I guess my question is, what are the common rules of the road, or can we come to common rules of the road? And what are legitimate national security considerations? And where do we go beyond national security into other things that are less legitimate?
Okay, you've got three questions there.
Great questions. Yeah, and by the way, any of these could take the entire session, but I will not subject you to that. Look, on ASEAN, we have excellent commercial and political relations with the ASEAN countries. But something that's important to keep in mind is that, and Secretary Blinken has been clear on this, we are not asking countries to choose. In fact, I always point out that China is one of our top three markets, and we have substantial commercial relations with China. So we're not asking countries to choose. What we're asking for in China is a level playing field, is a respect for IPR, is allowing our companies to compete in the Chinese market, and also for them to not engage in unlawful subsidies with their companies. If we can get a level playing field, we'll take our chances. And I have seen over and over again, and that's really what our engagement is with countries. I have seen over and over that our companies will win some and lose some, but they'll do okay if they are allowed to compete fairly. And that's really what we're aiming to do in the ASEAN countries and elsewhere. But otherwise, we trade ourselves, as you know. We have commercial relations with China that continue to increase. Scalability, great question. Because, and that's what, when I said about putting together a playbook, we actually have discussions with allies and partners regularly to get them to do the same thing that we did, to come up with their own playbook. And some of it is by virtue of having regular conversations and regular meetings on these issues. The personal side of it is important. You know who to call if you need support, if you need help in getting country X to open up its markets to the next Lithuania. I'm very proud of that we put together a set of world-class economists at the State Department. We didn't have that before. Well, some of these people actually know a fair amount of trade. They're the ones that are able to look at a country and figure out its vulnerabilities. And so preparation is important, creating that playbook and having constant conversations with other countries. And the benefit of this is that countries like Japan are, by when it was the chair of the G7, actually made it one of the top 3 priorities in G7. They have created an economic coercion platform. So scalability is important. What happens when I'm out of there and the next person takes over? We've learned a lot, and we've got to make sure that the memory, the muscle memory, remains. Rules of national security. We can talk about that. Why don't we just? I'll take that offline because it's a much longer conversation. I don't want to take more.
Well, with that, Jose, we want to thank you for joining us this morning. Please join me in a round of applause.